How long have you had these droids?
About 3 or 4 seasons.
They're up for sale if you want them.
Let me see your identification.
You don't need to see his identification.
We don't need to see his identification.
These aren't the droids you're looking for.
These aren't the droids we're looking for.
He can go about his business.
You can go about your business.
Move along.
Move along. Move along.
Remember when those movies were good? If only it were that simple, right? If only all you needed to persuade people was a hoodie and a wave of the hand and maybe a British accent, and you could get anyone to believe anything that you wanted them to believe. This is the best workshop you've ever been to. No? You will all give me $100. It doesn't work at all, sadly. But if I were a Jedi, you would go out and make $100 and give it to me. But sadly, thank you, Aaron, for letting me borrow your hoodie for that important moment in the... Yes, I forgot my hoodie. Sadly, persuading people is not that easy. In fact, persuading people to change their minds, change their behavior, take a different position is extremely difficult. But it's not impossible, and you can learn to be better at it. And that's something that anybody who wants to be a leader or an activist needs to do, because in many areas of our life, professional and personal, we're trying to persuade people of things all the time. And that's what this workshop is about. This workshop for the next 3 hours, with liberal breaks and activities in between, is all about how you can become a more persuasive person, a more persuasive leader, an activist. Now, to start off, I want you to encourage to tweet throughout this presentation the nuggets of wisdom that I give you. You can find me on Twitter at JFLCroft, and the hashtag for this is CFICon. And I'm going to begin this presentation by giving you a very brief overview of what I think persuasion is and what it's not, and also a sense of the broad topics we're going to discuss over the next 3 hours. Then I'll take some big questions if you have any, and then we'll move into the meat of it, which is exploring and practicing a set of persuasive tactics. So what is persuasion? Well, persuasion is not power. One way that you can get people to change their behavior is to influence them through the exercise of power, force, or coercion. So ways that you might do that would be through a physical threat, or by withholding resources from them, like money, or by exercising the authority given to you in some power structure, like if they're your employee, you can exercise power over them in some situations, or in a military chain of command, you can exercise power. You can just tell people what to do and expect them to do it. That's not persuasion. Neither is persuasion negotiation. Now, while persuasion might be involved and will be involved in many negotiation processes, negotiation is characterized by the fact that you want something from somebody else and they want something from you. And so the process of negotiation is figuring out what you can give them to get what you want them to give you. It's transactional in that way. That's not what I'm talking about here either. Rather, I'm talking about voluntary influence. Persuasion is the process of using rhetoric, arguments, force of character, humor, to make other people voluntarily change their behavior. So they choose to do what you want them to do, because your argument is just so persuasive. That means that persuasion is extremely powerful, because it's the only form of influence you can exercise over other people when you don't have any power over them and you don't have anything that they want. When you're not in a position to exercise power, when you have nothing to negotiate with, you can still persuade. You can still try and get other people to voluntarily change their minds. And we can all think of many, many different situations that we've been in where persuasion is something that we were trying to do. And activists do this all the time. And so do student leaders. So for instance, if you want to convince people to come to an event you've organized on campus, very often you're going to try and persuade them. You're not going to give them anything, maybe food, right? But really what you're trying to do is persuade them that it's worth their time and that they want to come. If you're opposing a piece of legislation that you don't like, very often you're trying to persuade the public or the legislature to change their minds. You don't have direct power over those people. You don't have anything to give them in exchange, but you have the power of your persuasion. If you want your high school to allow you to form a secular student group or an atheist club and they're being resistant to it, again, you don't have much power, you don't have much to negotiate with, but you can persuade them by making a strong case. If you want to convince people to change their beliefs about climate change or about evolution or any of the topics that we really care about as a secular community, very often it's persuasion that you're going to use. And that's why we think it's really, really important for activists to get better at it. And that is what this workshop is about. In the next 3 hours, I'm going to be presenting to you and helping you practice 10 principles of persuasion, all of which have been validated through experimental test to actually make people more persuasive. I learned all this stuff from a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, which is a place where people go to from all over the world to study how to become a better leader. We have CEOs and former presidents and military leaders and religious leaders and people from all over the world coming to become better leaders. And one of the courses I helped teach there was taught by a professor called Gary Oren, who's been teaching this class for decades. And he works with these people to try and make them more persuasive. And I have one little story about that to illustrate this really works. He once had a young student at the Harvard Law School in his class. And that student used to, after class, go and speak to Gary about the direction of his life and what he wanted to do, because although he was studying law, he wasn't sure he wanted to be a lawyer and saw the legal profession as his ultimate end goal. And ultimately, although he did become a lawyer and the editor of the Harvard Law Review, he eventually went into politics. And he developed a national name for himself. In fact, he was asked to give a really big, important speech. And when he was asked to give that speech, he invited Gary to be in the audience to thank Professor Oren for everything he'd learned in his persuasion class. That speech was to the Democratic National Convention. The student was Barack Obama. In case you've missed it, he's now president of the United States. And he thought that he learned so much from this class, which I helped teach and which I'm taking all this material from to present to you, that he wanted to thank the professor for how it helped his political career. This stuff really works. It's not just based on anecdotes, it's based on the experience of many people who've taken it throughout the years and through all sorts of experimental studies. One of my favorite studies about this is that they got waiters, or wait staff I should say, to basically, they do these all sorts of cool experiments, but one of them was they get wait staff to say, respond differently to the question, what would you recommend on the menu? So they have plants in the place and they say, well, what would you recommend? And some wait staff would just say, oh, everything's good. And the other ones would make a specific recommendation. And then some of them would say, well, usually the fish tacos are really good, but today I tried them earlier and the chef is off their game today, so I would recommend this other thing instead. And they found that the third group of waitstaff made way more in tips than the other two groups, even though they had told them that something on the menu was bad, which is kind of counterintuitive. Those are the sorts of studies I'm talking about, experimental tests of different ways of interacting with people that show concrete differences in how they respond to you. And we're going to study 10 principles of persuasion today, split into 3 broad buckets. These 3 buckets were developed by the great Greek philosopher Aristotle. I know that there's at least one lover of classical literature in the room, so that's good. There you are at the back there. And Aristotle was super interested in rhetoric, or the art of persuasion. He separated it into three different categories: logos, ethos, and pathos. And I'm going to teach you three principles that come under each of these three headings. So logos is Captain Spock, right? Or Mr. Spock, I should say. He only became a captain later in his career. That's your rational argument, your statistics, and data. And that's a very, very important part of any argument, and we're going to explore how to make an argument effectively through that. But we're generally pretty comfortable with this part. The secular movement is good with rational arguments and statistics and data. We like them. We assume other people like them too. Sadly, it turns out other people don't really care about them. Most people are not very persuaded by a rational argument with statistics and data to back it up. The empirical studies just show it doesn't make a huge difference. It makes some difference. The studies I've read suggest it accounts for about 30% of the effectiveness of any message that you convey to some people. But it's not the main driver of people's behavior. The main things that change people's behavior come under the other two headings, which are ethos and pathos. Now, ethos is uhura. That's your credibility and authority and likability as a messenger. And who else could be more credible and likable than Lieutenant Uhura, who always gets to speak to the aliens, because she has this credibility and authority. Ethos deals with how credible are you as a speaker. If logos is the content of your message and answers the question, what are you talking to me about? Ethos answers the question, who are you to be telling me to do this? And that turns out to be an extremely important question people ask when you're trying to persuade them of something. So we have three principles under the heading of ethos that we're going to explore. And then finally, my favorite, Captain Kirk, pathos, the emotional, passionate connection. You'll notice I take the new Captain Kirk rather than the old Captain Kirk because I'm a homosexual. And Chris Pine, what can I say? So, no, William Shatner was super hot in his day, let's be honest. But pathos deals with the emotional appeal you make to the audience, the connection you make with other people, the personal nature of your argument. If logos answers what is your argument and ethos answers who are you to be making this argument to me, pathos answers the question, why should I care? Which is ultimately the most important part of the whole process. Because even if you're really convincing and people think you're credible, if they don't care about what you're telling them, they're still not going to change what they do or what they think. It turns out that this is the most important. But I said I would give you 10 principles, and those math geniuses among you will be able to work out that 3 logos, 3 ethos, 3 pathos only makes... See if I can, everybody. Math geniuses, thank you. So there is one overarching principle that applies to all of these categories and everything you want to do as a persuasive person, which we have to keep in mind throughout this whole 3 hours, which is know the audience. It turns out that knowing who you're speaking to, what they care about, what sort of language they use, what their cultural background is, what's going on in their community, is the single most important thing you need to do to become a more effective persuader. Most people, we estimate, spend about 80% of their time thinking about what they want to say, and then about 20% of their time tweaking it to fit a given audience. And throughout everything we do today, I want you to keep in mind that you should flip that around. You should spend about 80% of your time thinking about who you're speaking to, and 20% of your time picking the most important parts of your argument that are relevant to that audience. That means you should never give the same speech twice. I never do as a speaker. Always rewrite it for different audiences to a greater or lesser degree. Should always start with who is the audience and why do they care about what I have to say. That's the overarching 10th meta principle of the whole process of persuasion. So we're going to spend about an hour of chunk on each of these 3 sections, a little less time on logos because most people are already more comfortable about that. And I'm going to have a little presentation about the principles and then an activity that you're going to do in groups that helps you practice those principles, and then we'll hear back from you about what you did. Now, there are 3 principles that I want to teach you when it comes to making a really clear, compelling, rational argument so that you get that logos leg of your tripod really, really firmly and securely. So the first one is KISS, keep it simple, stupid. Not keep it simple and stupid, but keep it simple, comma, stupid. The second one is the effective use of analogies and metaphors, which can be quite difficult, but is a really important art to develop. And the third one is a little technique which we call statistic plus story, which I absolutely love. So first, KISS, keep it simple, stupid. The best messages are really simple ones. And what I mean by simple is develop a one-sentence summary of your whole argument, not one sentence with 3 subordinate clauses and, comma, and, semicolon, and. One sentence of a single clause encapsulating what you're trying to convey to people. And then illustrate that one sentence with 3 central points that you want them to understand. 1, 2, 3. And again, be really strict with yourself that these are really 3 points and not 3 points each with subpoints. Because when we do this, everyone wants to add in more and more and more. Cut it right down so that you can make a one-sentence, super clear summary of what you want to say and 3 central points. All the studies show that after you make 3 points, the recall in the audience drops dramatically. I mean, you look at these graphs and they're like, first point recall, second point recall, third point recall, fourth point recall. It's like down there. I'm not kidding, that's what they look like. You may ask me why I'm trying to teach you 10 things for the next 3 hours, but sometimes you have to make accommodations. But one sentence summary, 3 central points. Okay? Any questions about that? Seems simple, right? That's the first one. The second one is the use of analogies and metaphors. Now, we've already had one, or actually we've had 4, basically, analogies and metaphors in the presentation. What have they been? The presentation I've given today. Yes, the Spock, Kirk.
Star Wars. No, and Star Wars. Not
Oh yeah, we have had Star Wars. I was like, I thought you were saying that those 3 characters.
It's called Jedi Mind.
I know. I was like, oh, that's nothing to do with Star Wars. Captain Kirk is not in Star Wars. Oh, don't do that to me. So we've had a Star Wars analogy. Jedi mind tricks is a analogy or a metaphor for what we're learning, right? We've had the 3 different characters from Star Trek to illustrate the different things. We've had the idea of the tripod, the idea, which is an illustration, that these 3 legs, the logos, ethos, and pathos, have to be in place if your argument's going to stand up. Now, when you're making a really good analogy or metaphor, it has to be accessible to the audience. That goes back to know the audience, right? If you're like, as George R.R. Martin said in the Game of Thrones trilogy, to an audience of people who have never read Game of Thrones, then firstly, why are you speaking to those people? And secondly, they're not going to get your analogy, right? You have to remember that your analogy has to actually be grokkable. It might be you might be like, oh, I love this analogy, it's so good, but then you go to an audience who's never heard of the famous person that you're referencing or the mathematical concept that you think is similar to this element of volleyball or whatever it is. And if they don't understand it, it's useless. So it has to be accessible to the audience. And it should be evocative in a sort of visual or emotional way. Tripod is good because it's easy to visualize. Everyone pretty much can imagine what a tripod looks like if one of the legs is too short. And it's kind of a funny little visual image of a wonky tripod. And people who are into Star Trek will have super strong feelings about Kirk and all those people like that, so it might be evocative for them. But people who are not into Star Trek, they're like, what was he talking about for the last 10 minutes, right? So your analogy and metaphor needs to be accessible to the audience and evocative in some visual or emotional way that really captures the attention. Any questions about that? Okay. And then the third one is my favorite one, which is never a statistic without a story, never a story without a statistic. Whenever you use a statistic, when you talk to people, you should illustrate it with a story about an actual person that is underlying that statistic. So for instance, you might say that there are 1 million children in this country who are forced to read the Bible every morning and noon and night, and it's a terrible tragedy. Let me tell you about one of those children, James Croft, who had this particular experience, and you illustrate it with a specific experience. Statistics on their own, just the numbers, they do something, but it's difficult for people to really imagine what that's about. But if you give it a particular story to hang on, it's a lot easier for people to imagine 1 million James Crofts in that little story than, oh geez, can you imagine 1 million James Crofts? Don't imagine that, please. It's a lot easier for them to imagine that than to just imagine what 1 million faceless people might look like who have this experience. So always illustrate any statistic you use with a personal story. And your statistic has to be visual and clear. It's better not to use tons of huge numbers. And percentages are never that good. If you can find a statistic which you can make really clear, maybe by the use of analogy, right? Which is, 1 million people suffer from this. That's as many as you could fit in 112 baseball fields, or something like that really makes it very clear to people. The statistic is going to come to life more. And one further little tip about this one is I always suggest putting the story first. Motivate and then explain. It's the personal story that gets people engaged in the topic, and then the statistic shows how big the problem is. So if you're talking about freedom of speech in countries which limit it, and you talk about Raif Badawi and his 1,000 lashes, and that's your story or what have you, in Saudi Arabia, or where, was it Iran? I forget where. Saudi Arabia, good, excellent. I was right. So if you talk about that story, and that's the story that you're using to illustrate the bigger problem, you tell the story, you get them feeling bad about this guy and his situation, and then you say, and there are this many people like Raif Badawi, and then they're like, oh, that's a big problem, which I care about now. So it's a little technique to make statistics come to life, to bring a little color to your logos, richness to it. Does that make sense? Any questions about this technique? Was that a question? Okay. Excellent. Now, all these things might seem super obvious, and in a way, they kind of are. But what we find when we teach people how to do these things is that while these are obvious in principle, most people don't do them in practice. And the only way to get better at actually doing them so that they're part of you, they're instinctively part of how you communicate with people all the time. It'll infuriate your friends and family when you get really good at this, because you'll be so persuasive. They'll be like, why are we doing all these things for you? But the only way to make them part of you is to practice them. And that's what we're going to do right now with our first little activity. We're going to move on to ethos, and that is about the status of the messenger. Because it turns out that as important as your arguments and your data is, more important is how people perceive you as a messenger, how authoritative they see you as being, how likable they think you are, and whether you're engaging in acts of reciprocity, whether you're giving them something in the exchange. Not in terms of negotiation, but I'll get to that in just a second. So the first one is pretty obvious. People respond to authority figures. People who they consider to be authoritative in some area of life are more persuasive. This has been demonstrated through numerous empirical studies, including very simple ones, like if you have an actor who prepares to cross a road when the light is red, so they would be jaywalking, and then they go across the road in a group of people, more people will follow that person across the road if they are wearing a suit than if they are not. Simple as that. In other studies, they've demonstrated that simply wearing a lab coat makes you perceived as much more authoritative on scientific and medical matters, even if the person is not a doctor or a scientist. Just wearing the lab coat makes you seem more persuasive in those areas. And these have all been tested in experiments. So here are some things that you can do to bolster your own authority as a messenger or the authority of your message. You can leverage your qualifications. If you are, in fact, a doctor or a scientist or a military officer, an area where that's appropriate, then you can wear the appropriate garb and you can talk about your own qualifications, not in a way that makes you sound like completely self-obsessed, but in a way that makes it clear that you have some relevant expertise. Secondly, you can harness symbols of authority like medals or clothing, as I've been saying, or you can do this in a simple way by choosing where you decide to give your message. So, for instance, if you're starting a presidential campaign and you do it on the same place where Lincoln started his presidential campaign, like Barack Obama did, you're making a statement and you're trying to link yourself to the authority of Lincoln. Or when Glenn Beck had that rally on the Mall and he had those huge images of Lincoln all behind him. He's trying to get some of Lincoln's authority onto himself. You can use symbols in that way to leverage your authority. And thirdly, if you don't have much authoritativeness yourself as a speaker, you can quote or cite other authorities. You can find people who are respected authorities in the field and you can quote them or say that they agree with you. And this one is particularly effective if you find surprising authorities who are recognized as authoritative to your audience. Remember always, it's who's your audience. That's who we're thinking about. So, for example, if I said to a group of Republicans I was speaking to that Bill Clinton once said this thing, they don't always love Bill Clinton so much. So to them, even though I might think that Bill Clinton is the best president ever or whatever, they don't think that, and they're the people I'm trying to convince. So I should try and find a quote from Ronald Reagan, or who else do Republicans like? Donald Trump, Jesus, Attila the Hun. People of that sort. So for someone on Fox News, people like that. So if you're speaking to a Christian audience, you can quote Jesus. If you're speaking to a Jewish audience, you can quote from the Torah. You find authorities that are relevant to your audience. That's particularly key and something that people often forget. Any questions on authority? This is the most simplest one. Yes?
What about debunking the opponents? Like in this particular case, making the case that this Muslim organization doesn't speak for all Muslims in the university, or that there are more progressive Muslims that may support the right to practice.
Right.
Make their authority.
So another way that you can leverage this principle is by making the opposing arguments seem less authoritative and thereby yours seem more authoritative in comparison. You can certainly do that. I would recommend starting by making your own positive case as authoritative as possible and then think about how you can undermine the other case. And that's partly linked into this next bit, which is likability. Is there anybody here who doesn't like Kermit? I found someone! This is the first time I've ever done this. When I was trying to find a slide which would have something that everybody likes, I spent days thinking about this. And I was like, no one can not like Kermit. Come on. But you've broken my unbroken streak. I appreciate that. What do you like? Silence. Stunned silence. It's okay, you can tell me afterwards, it's fine. But the idea behind this is that the more likable a messenger is perceived as an audience, the more authoritative they are. If they like you, they will believe you more. That sometimes people get a bit upset about, but it's simply the truth, and I think you'll see that it's the truth if you think about it in your own lives. The people who you like are more likely to be respected by you and considered trustworthy authorities than the people who you dislike. It's much more likely that they're going to persuade you of something. And you can become more likable in these three ways: using a positive tone when you speak, using humor a lot, and demonstrating similarities with your audience. That one's particularly key. So positive tone: smile, raise your eyebrows, have an open facial and body expression. Don't demean other people or insult them. It's not convincing, right? It will make you seem less likable, and the less they like you, the less convinced you're going to be by them. And that is an empirical fact. They have studied this. They have had actors be nasty to people in experimental settings to see if those people will be more likely to do things that they want to do after that or not. And it shows that the more nasty you are to people, the less likely they are to do something for you. It sounds ridiculous when I say it explicitly like that. It sounds obvious. It's amazing how much atheist discourse has been based around demeaning other people. It's not persuasive. It doesn't work. The experiments show that it doesn't work. so use a positive tone, please. Also, be funny, right? The funnier you are, the more likable you are, and the more likely it is that people will relate to you and be persuaded by what you have to say. This can be very difficult, both of these, when you're talking about something you're angry about, that you're very passionate about. But you have to ask yourself the question, is it more important to you to demonstrate your anger than to be effective as a communicator and change the situation you're trying to change? And if it's more important for you to show that you're angry, then what I think that says is that your feelings are more important than the people who your activism is actually supposed to be for. And that sounds selfish to me. I think it's more important to control ourselves, to communicate in a way that the evidence shows is effective, even if it's not our first preference for how we might want to communicate. That we do this for other people and for the causes we care about. So let's do it well. That's my belief. So use humor. And then third, demonstrate similarities with your audience. Any time we feel like someone else is like us, we find them more persuasive. This can be challenging in a lot of different situations. It turns out that pretty much any form of similarity is enough to generate an increased sense of authority in a messenger. So this is why, I'll get to the question in just a second, why second-hand car salespeople are always from the town you grew up in. Right? Because even that similarity makes them more persuasive. Or they always have a brother who lived there or something like that. So this, you can activate this in many different ways. Dress like the people that you're speaking to. Speak in that idiom, as long as it doesn't come across as pandering. I'll say a little bit more about pandering in a second. Demonstrate that you've had similar experiences. This is the most powerful. If you have experienced a certain form of harm, for instance, you grew up in a very rigid, conservative religious home, and you know some of your audience have, and they've experienced some of the same things you have, then creating that connection is going to be very powerful. They're going to say, yes, this person is one of us. And once you're one of us, you're more persuasive. This is extremely powerful, this third one. So try and connect with your audience in that way. Paolo, you had a question. Do you have a mic? Yeah, there's one right there. Thank you.
Yeah, so you saying that actually just made me think about you talking about addressing the Missouri legislature. And how can I put this delicately? I would expect that many people in the Missouri legislature would not feel that you are similar to them. You know, British accent, gay.
Gay, British atheist?
And you know,
Dressed fabulously?
highly well educated. I could see why they would sort of
Harvard and
perceive
Cambridge
you.
degrees?
Yeah, exactly. So my question is, in cases like that, can actually acknowledging that difference and acknowledging how others may perceive you in a certain way, could that be effective?
What a great question. I could have planted that question. It's a great question. So the simple answer is yes. Acknowledging that you recognize that you're different from the audience in significant ways and making a self-deprecating joke about it is a very powerful way to diffuse some of that difference. Harvey Milk did this all the time. If you've seen the film Milk, he used to start some of his talks by saying something like, I left the heels at home today, or the dress, or something like that. He made a joke about people's stereotypes about gay people, right from the bat, which was self-deprecating. Self-deprecating humor is one of the most powerful forms of humor, because it ironically demonstrates your authority. We're going to get onto that in a second. But yeah, you can say, I know that I'm not, I've been doing this a lot in the Black Lives Matter movement, of saying, I recognize that I'm not a person of color, I have certain privilege, yada, yada, yada. That whole little talk that you do to say, I recognize this difference, that it's important, and that you understand that it's important. And I think the reason why that works is, weirdly, by acknowledging that you understand the difference and why it's important to the people you're speaking to, you're showing a similarity, which is you care about this issue and think about it in a similar way, and you get it. And showing that you get your audience is a way of demonstrating similarity. So that's a great question. There are also ways to show genuine similarity, even if there's a lot of difference. And I'll tell you a specific example of that. When I was in the legislature doing the lobbying, I found out we had little bios of the senators that we were speaking to. And I saw that one of them had been a teacher. And I've been a high school teacher. That's enough, right? I was there to talk to him about gay rights. I don't do a teaching. But one of the things I made sure I said is, I know that you're a teacher, and I was a high school teacher too, and I know how difficult that can be, and I know how important it is to have a stable teacher in a classroom for a long time with students. And can you imagine what would happen if a teacher who's been for many years in the same school was fired because suddenly the school found out that they were gay, which does happen in Missouri? That would be really bad for those kids, and I know you care about kids. That's all you need, right? That little 1/2 a sentence in a bio creates a personal connection and a similarity. So good question. The third ethos principle is reciprocity, which is basically if we give something to somebody, they're more likely to give something back to us. The reason why this isn't negotiation is because we're not saying, if I give you this, then you give us that. It's not framed in terms of a transaction that way. It's just thinking of ways that you can give things to people, not even physical things. So for instance, if you are doing a presentation, you can give them something, like here's a little gift from our organization, or here's a free, I don't know, persuasion guide or something like that you might give out. It will make you more persuasive because they'll be like, oh, thanks. So you can give out stuff, that's fine. But a more powerful form of reciprocity, which you can do when you don't have anything to give people physically, is make a concession. This is so important, and people never do it. Oh, I'm so passionate about concession. The lights went off. That is so important. Find something in your case to concede to the other side. I recognize that the opponents of this measure have a real deep commitment to this, and that this bill doesn't address that, and that's a problem, and I agree with you on that. Find some way to give something up. Nothing critical to your argument, right? Don't go in there, as I heard someone do once, and go, well, my case is all bullshit, basically, but here it is. You don't give up the whole thing. You find a little piece that is strategically insignificant, and you make a big show of giving it to them, right? Basically, you make it very clear that you are graciously conceding to the other side this trifling point that doesn't matter. You don't say it's a trifling point that doesn't matter. You know it's a trifling point that doesn't matter because you're a smart strategic operator. But you give them that concession. Because what you're giving them really in that transaction is respect. You are respecting them enough to have made a good point, to be individuals who have good ideas. And when you give other people respect, they're more likely to give you respect, and that raises your ethos. In a funny sort of way, a self-deprecating joke is a sort of concession. It's like, oh, I'm not really so great, as you might think, or I might think. And I recognize that, and I'm giving away a little bit of my self-esteem here, or my self-image, or something like that. And weirdly, that makes people like you more and think you're more authoritative. Because they're like, oh, well, only people who are actually quite secure can make fun of themselves. So, super important, reciprocity. So those are the three things: authority, likability, reciprocity. Any questions on any of those? Yes?
Does it matter how obvious it is that it's trifling?
Yeah, does it matter how obvious it is that your concession is trifling? Yes. Try and be honest about this. Try and find something that's actually a little bit difficult for you to concede, because that will make it more genuine, and you don't want it to seem manipulative. Well, let me say it more strongly. You don't want it to be manipulative, right? You don't want to be fake about it. You want to find something that you can genuinely concede, but that isn't critical to your case. So yes, it matters. Yeah?
There are some cases, too, talking about being genuine. It was mentioned back there that sometimes there'll be vast differences between the speaker and the audience. And acknowledging those differences, you said, is a good way.
Yeah.
But isn't also sometimes, if you're trying to do the other thing, can't that fail you severely? As in, if you're trying to bridge the gap and say, oh, we have these likenesses, but you really don't. Like, what was the thing with Mitt Romney getting a tan?
Yeah.
Like, that just like...
Great. So never try and pretend you have similarities with your audience that you don't have. That's called pandering, right? There's a difference between demonstrating genuine similarities, places where the Venn diagrams of your life really overlap, and trying to smudge the lines of the Venn diagram so that it looks like you have similarities you don't have. Okay, imagine how, okay, we've had an extraordinarily clear example of a real crystal clear case, which was the NAACP Rachel Dolezal, right? Okay, so that is an attempt to create a similarity which did or did not exist, depending on how you construct that. But the fact that many people perceive that to be totally illegitimate, and I'm not making a judgment in this case, I'm just using it as an example, devastated her ethos, right? You could just see it destroyed. Never do that. I'm never going to pretend that I'm not a huge nerd who likes Star Trek and Star Wars and all that stuff, right? I'm not going to go into some place and say, oh yeah, that type of music, I really like that too, yeah. It's fake, it's manipulative, you're lying in order to try and demonstrate similarity. That's why this whole business of persuasion has a bad name. Never do that. And if you can't find genuine similarities between you and the audience you want to reach, what does that mean? What do you do? Well, you could just admit that. Find someone else. Like sometimes you're not the best messenger. You know, I turn down speaking engagements for audiences I don't think I will. And it pains me because I'm a huge egotist. Right? I like doing this. But self-deprecating humor, you see. I like doing this, but if I think I'm not going to connect with an audience, I'm like, particularly over issues that really matter, I'm like, you don't want me to talk about this. You want this person to talk about this. I'm not the right messenger. That's fine. That's part of the strategy. Okay. We have to, last question, then we have to move on to the activity. No, if it's quick.
So, as someone who's been raised in this and coming to these things, I've learned that logical fallacies are very bad, and if you do them, you're one of the bad guys. And so, I know, I know that this is something I always run into when I study rhetoric and go to classes about it. But like the authority thing, it seems like the appeal to authority, and when I diminish someone else's authority, it seems like ad hominem, and it just makes the skeptic part of me sick and like I'm doing something.
Yeah. So demonstrating your legitimate authority in a subject area is not the logical fallacy appeal to authority, right? You're not saying that because I am an authority, what I have to say is true. You have your logos to demonstrate what you have to say is true, right? That's what that's supposed to be doing. What it's trying to do is to activate a sort of emotional reaction in your audience that says, oh, this person is worth listening to on this topic. People will not hear out a logical argument if they don't think you're worth listening to on it. That's one of the big problems with the vaccine debate, is that many people don't see scientists as legitimate authorities anymore, and so they don't listen to the arguments. They have all the evidence that they could possibly want. People just don't listen to it. If scientists were a little bit better at generating their ethos, maybe we wouldn't have this problem. So this is not a way of avoiding the truth. This is a way that people will listen to the truth when you present it to them, which they otherwise might not. So finally, pathos. This is your emotional connection with an audience. This is the way that you really show that the issue matters. If you've answered the question, what is this issue about? What's your argument? Who are you to be talking to me about this, and why should I listen to you? This answers the question, why does it matter? And that is the most important question. Because if you get people to think that your issue matters, they might do it even if they don't have a good reason to do it, or even if they don't think that you're very trustworthy. This is the only one that potentially stands on its own, really, as part of an argument. And there are 3 techniques that I'm going to take you through. The first one is specificity. When you are talking about, when you're giving a story about something that's happened to you, or something that's happened to other people that you want people to care about, it's essential that that story be specific. We were working a little bit on this already. When did it happen? You know, what could you feel and smell in the air and all this other stuff? Like, it's storytelling. John Hodgman, my favorite fake internet judge and comedian, says specificity is the soul of narrative. Specific, concrete details. Can't be general. And this particularly relates to details of harm, right? In many of the situations we're activists about, we care about them because people are harmed by the situation. We need to find concrete details of individual people who are harmed and talk about them. That's why the Raif Badawis and the Jessica Alquists of the world become popular and famous and well-known figures, because they are faces which represent wider injustices. They're individual people. It's Mike Brown, actually. A single instance that represents a systemic problem. We have to find those incidences about the issues that we care about. We as human beings care about other individual human beings, not about abstract problems. So the more that you can make this stuff about individual cases and give concrete details about how the situation has harmed them, the more people will care about it. And that can be you. That could be hearing about how your materials were defaced or you got unfriendly Facebook messages. And you really, I'm just stressing this again, the details are super important. It can feel really grisly to find out about, I did a talk once about the suicides of LGBTQ young people. And to do that talk, I found out the names of people who had killed themselves and exactly how they had killed themselves. And tried to really paint that image in people's minds so they could feel what it might be like to have a kid who kills himself for this reason. It feels kind of ghoulish and creepy to do that, but all we're doing is telling the truth about why this stuff matters. And if we don't do that, why should anyone care about it? We mustn't silence ourselves or silence the victims of these things by refusing to talk about what happened. So be very specific. Secondly, you have to actually engage the emotions, including your own. You have to allow yourself to be emotional about the topics that you talk about. A demonstration of emotion from a speaker does not show that they're untrustworthy, it shows that they're trustworthy. If you have someone who comes before you and says, yeah, I really care about this issue, it really matters because of A, B, and C reasons, and here's the statistic, and they show no emotional engagement with it, I am not trusting that that person cares about the issue or they think it's important. When we think something is important, we act differently about it than the things we think is not important. So allow yourself to be emotional. The actual emotions that you feel, let them show. To do that, you can find stories, either about your own life or other people's lives, which genuinely move you. Stories which, when you tell them to people, they bring up emotions, so that people can see that you care about it through your emotional reaction. Always be on the lookout for stories like that. I have a folder on my computer of stories like that I go to when I need to make a case. Like, I need this story now. That's the one that generates the right emotions. And then third is personalization. This is the same stuff again and again. This is my friend Sam. I'm going to tell you a story about him in a second. Make it about a specific person. If your issue harms a specific individual person, it's much more vivid to people than if it harms 1 million people. It's a weird psychological fact that 1 million people suffering from something is much less interesting to us than one person with a face and a name suffering from that same thing, which is why all these campaigns to give money or to, like the telethons and stuff like that, are peppered with individual stories about kids or about people who have this disease or things like that. It's all about stories of individual people. So find those individual people and make it very clear how they're affected by the issue that you want to change. So I put a photo of Sam up there because his personal story is a very powerful one for me and for many people that he has used to become a nationally known activist against conversion therapy, which is the sort of therapy that tries to turn gay people straight. And I got to know Sam when he moved to Boston a few years ago, and we were an activist together. And I asked him if I could use his story to illustrate what I mean about all these aspects of pathos. So I'm going to tell you his story about what happened to him as a kid. And this account of it appeared in a New England magazine called Bay Windows, and it was written by Hannah Clay Wareham. I didn't write this, so this is what she wrote. What Sam calls the first step of his therapy involved attaching his hands to a table with leather straps, palms up. The therapist placed blocks of ice on each hand and showed Sam the pictures of 2 men holding hands, so that the young boy began to associate touching men with what he called the burning cold. The second step was similar, but the ice was replaced with copper heating coils that had been wrapped around his wrists and hands. The heat was turned on when pictures of 2 men holding hands were shown, but turned off when pictures of a heterosexual couple holding hands were shown. Following these sessions, Sam would shudder when hugged by his father, experiencing what he calls heat flashbacks. The third step accompanied Sam's first attempt at committing suicide. There have been 5. He was strapped into a chair, and small needles were stuck into his fingertips. The needles were attached to electrodes, and Sam received shocks when shown pornographic images of 2 men engaging in sex acts. That's Sam's story. Every time I read it, I almost cry because it's really terrible. Now, checking your gut right now, if I asked you to sign a petition to make conversion therapy illegal across the United States, how many would be inclined to sign it? Pretty much everybody. I don't see anybody who's not. On the basis of just that story, you haven't heard an argument. I haven't given you a logos. I could be anybody, right, frankly. I know I'm a very authoritative person, but my ethos doesn't come into this a huge amount. It's the power of the emotional connection that Sam has made to you through my telling his story. You can picture Sam in the situation because of the details that it gave about what was done to him and how it affected him. That's pathos. It's the most powerful of all this because we're social animals, we want to connect with other people. It's why we do our work as activists, is because we care about other people. Making people care about the issues you care about is the biggest part of being persuasive. And look how, like, it's a tiny story. It like takes up 3 short paragraphs and it creates a huge emotional resonance. Now, I'm not saying, please go out and have terrible experiences so you can tell people about your terrible experiences. Everybody has experienced pain. I haven't. No. I'll get to your question. Everybody has suffered in some way, and a lot of people have suffered in ways that are relatable to others. Find out what those things are for you, the things that have power for you to still move you. I still remember getting so angry at my friends when they used to make fun of me all the time for doing ballet, which I actually really like to do, that I got really violent once and pushed one of them in front of a car. He didn't get hit by the car, sadly. But no, I'm sorry. But I was very, very angry. I had huge anger issues in middle school because I was bullied so much for that. It still makes me angry to think about it today. There are things that you've experienced that you can use to galvanize people to care about your cause. There are things that other people have experienced that you haven't, which you can tell people about to make people care about why this stuff matters. Now, I think this stuff is super important. And I want to take a moment before we end, because we've got like 5 minutes. And I'm quite happy to answer questions, big questions, when we're eating, if that's the next thing. Is eating the next thing that happens? Thank God. There is a God. Yay. So the one question that I want to respond to that comes up, particularly about this pathos thing, is, isn't this manipulative, right? Isn't what we're doing tugging on people's heartstrings to make them do what we want them to do? And the answer is it can be, right? There are situations in which this can be very manipulative. Many people have used people's emotions to encourage them to do things that otherwise they wouldn't do in a manipulative way. And the way that in the class that I used to help teach, we dealt with this was that in order for something not to be manipulative, we had a mnemonic for it, which is it has to be on track. T-R-A-C. I think that's it. Which is what you say at all times has to be T, true, right? You cannot make up stuff that happened to you in order to make people feel some care about an issue, right? You have to speak the truth. The statistics you choose have to, in your judgment, honestly represent the actual situation, right? That has to be true. The stuff has to be relevant to the case that you're making. So in some situations, even very powerful personal stories are not relevant to the actual issue that you're exploring. I had one student once who told a very powerful story about how her father was killed in an accident. It was very emotional. It really engaged us with her. And then went on to say something about the pipeline in the Middle East they were trying to build, which had nothing to do with the story. And I was in a really difficult position as a teacher at that moment to say, I feel the emotion in your story. You told it well. I feel connected to you. I'm so sorry that happened to you. But you're trying to manipulate us, right? It has no relevance to the issue that you're trying to, and you shouldn't do that. So it has to be relevant, right? True, relevant, And I'm now going to forget what A and C stand for because I can never remember this whole thing. I'll find, like, it's other stuff which basically says the same thing as true. Oh yeah, autonomy is A. You respect the autonomy of the people that you're speaking to. To persuade is to understand other people have a right to disagree. It's to engage with each other as human beings who have their own thoughts, which might be different to your own, which is why you're trying to persuade them. And to put people in a position where they feel like they have to agree with you, you're not really persuading anymore. You're starting to manipulate, you're starting to move into the area of coercion. And C, I really won't remember. Like, I don't know. I don't know what it is. But it's something equally important. But using emotions, one of my favorite writers on these topics, Drew Weston, says that there is no correlation between the extent to which your appeal is emotional and the extent to which it is manipulative. Those two are not related in any way. You can manipulate people with data and logical arguments as much as you can manipulate people with emotion. And as I was saying to a couple of people outside, the choice not to engage emotionally with other people is, I think, very manipulative. And the trying to teach people that their emotions doesn't matter, isn't that like one of the most manipulative things you could possibly do? Our emotions are often one of the, we have terms like gut check because we recognize that sometimes emotions tell us something really, really, really important. So don't get trapped into this idea or that emotions are manipulative. So to conclude, that's one of the reasons that I call this workshop Jedi Mind Tricks for Activists, because I think sometimes secular people particularly are under the illusion that the best way to pursue our agenda is to put aside all those dastardly tools that other people's use, like emotions, and we are going to stick to our own, Robert's Rules of Order or whatever it's called, of just using data and logical arguments and pretend everyone's like Spock, right? And then we will be pure to our own beliefs that rationalism is the only most important thing. You cannot win like that. We can choose to do that, and we will lose every significant battle for civil rights or social acceptance or equality that we ever fight. And we will hopefully feel bad about it, or maybe we won't feel anything because we've turned into Spock, right? I call this Jedi Tricks for Activists because I think the way to respond to the Sith Lords of the world, the manipulators and the fearmongers, is to train Jedi. We can't put aside the Force. You can't beat a lightsaber with a blaster pistol. It's been tried, right? You have to train people with the lightsaber and the Force, who fight for good, who use them for good reasons. That's what I hope you're going to be. I hope you're going to be the Jedi for the secular movement. I hope you're all going to wear shit-colored robes and grow ridiculous beards and speak in gnomic voices, right? And go around going like this to everybody you meet. And maybe one of you will turn into a very small wizened alien who has green skin and really big ears. That would actually make my life if you did that. I'm going to stop talking because I don't know what I'm saying anymore. Thank you very much for spending 3 hours with me.